program. I doubt if this is the case. I suspect most people in this room are familiar with this to some degree. But if you are not, I'm hoping that at my presentation, and I'm sure Fred's also, will be self-contained. Our object is going to try to be to explain everything from scratch so that you will be able to follow along. What is called the transformation problem, notice the quotation marks around the words transformation problem, can be very technical in some of its aspects. It involves equations and ways to represent equations, diagrams, and so forth. None of that will be in these presentations, I think. We want to make it as accessible as possible. We did a very technical session at the Allied Social Sciences Associations in January. And now we're doing this one, which is going to be of a different character. And we do want to address the question in the title. So what is the real significance of this? Is this just Marxism for the Marxists? You know, there was a Cuban cartoon which had a professory type sitting in front of a wall of books, and the caption has him saying, "El deber de todo teorista es esperar que otro haga la revolución." You know, the duty of every revolutionist is to hope that someone else makes the revolution. You know, so I don't want you to think we're doing that. You know, I really do, I can only speak for myself, I really do think this is important. It's important politically, even though it may not seem that way in all of its aspects. And when you first get into it, it is. It is important politically and in terms of the theory, which is the foundation of our way of approaching the world, revolutionary transformation and so forth. So that'll be at the end of my presentation. I've picked three little illustrations, 1, 2, and 3 they're labeled, out of, do you need one of out of various publications of my own, going back in some cases 15 years or so. Let me just go through them. Let me explain, okay? Let's look at number 1. Now you see those little circles with crosses with time signs in them. Those are just little placeholders. That's to avoid writing down numbers or writing down symbols or anything of that kind. They're little amounts. What you have is 3 industries. An industry is represented horizontally. It goes across. And in each of the 3 industries, never mind what the capital letters underneath stand for. We'll get to that. In each of those 3 industries, there are material input costs, things that a capitalist firm has to buy. I suppose I should have begun by saying this is intended as a representation of an abstract capitalist economy, right? And I hope everyone is comfortable with that. We're leaving out of account all sorts of principles according to which the working class is stratified, and indeed the capitalist class can be stratified to financial and industrial capital, or any of these kinds of issues. All of that is being left to one side for the moment. We're focusing in on a very fundamental picture of a competitive capitalist economy. I didn't think these were going to run out. I'm amazed. Hello.
Hi.
One for each of you. And if too many more people come in, we're going to have to share them.
Can I get one?
Oh,
Can I get one too?
that's it. We're in sharing mode. I need one for myself. I made 20. I didn't think we would have that many people. I'm astounded. Okay. So you have material input costs in an industry, wage costs, and profit. In a sort of a way, this is the way a capitalist economy would look, and this is the way capitalist economists, including the great ones like Adam Smith, would have described the price structure of a capitalist economy. And those three things add up to the value of output in each of the 3 industries. We don't need to specify what the industries are. We don't need to do anything like that at this stage. Okay? Now, the one on the left is therefore like a diagram of an entire economy. And if you like, what you can do is you can think of these 3 industries as representing n industries, or any larger number. The way mathematicians would do that is that they put a line of dots between the second and third one to indicate that this is a representation where there are as many rows as you like to conceive of. Okay? So this is a representation of a capitalist economy. And on the left side, we have direct labor embodied. In other words, this is the way the picture of the economy that's drawn in the earliest chapters of Capital, Volume 1, this is the way it appears, okay? Material input costs appear as Marx's category constant capital. Why he says constant is a subject we can take up. The wage costs appear as Marx's category variable capital. And every single one of these quantities, the circle, is a quantity of labor time. Now, in fact, it may be a quantity, but we'll get to the subject of what quantities they are, but they start out in Marx's imagery as quantities of labor time. He speaks of the value of a commodity. Think of any one of the circles under the column value of output. That quantity of value is the sum of the labor directly and indirectly needed to produce the commodity, and that's what those three things add up to. So these are quantities of labor time. Now, what is the transformation business all about? Around 1865, Marx produced a manuscript. We know it, would you believe it, as the manuscript of 1865. Parts of it are still being published, translated, not completely done yet. And in that manuscript, Marx addressed a very significant problem. And this is the material that eventually wound up as Volume 3 of Capital, Parts 1 and 2 of Volume 3 of Capital. Essentially, the problem is that if the workers are equally exploited in all the industries, and that's an assumption that you want to make at this level of abstraction. You want to say that workers are equally exploited in all the industries, because if they weren't, they could move. So this is important because Marx is assuming away all arbitrary blockages and barriers and monopolies and asymmetric information and anything that might complicate the picture. He is in the 19th century. He is witnessing the Industrial Revolution. He is among multitudes of post-Ricardian socialists in England and French revolutionaries, political revolutionaries, and the German immigrant population in London and the German political parties, such as existed after the reaction set in after 1848 in Germany, and all of that, and everyone is complaining about capitalism, right? They're not necessarily calling it capitalism yet, but they're talking about exploitation. And exploitation, well, what does it come from? It's those capitalists and their evil mustaches. It's their criminal behavior. It's their monopoly power. It's their this, it's their that, it's their other thing. Now the problem is, in many individual cases, it is all those things. It can be. But what Marx's project in Capital is to sweep away all of that and get to the essential process that's going on. And for that purpose, he wants to give capitalism the best story it knows how to tell. And the best story capitalism knows how to tell is that it's, what Marx would say, the language he would use is that the law of value operates freely and fully. And that workers, what this means is that there are no restrictions on people's movement from one sector to another when they perceive a benefit from that movement. So that if workers were being exploited more in one industry than another, they would move away from that industry, move into the one where the rate of exploitation is lower. And that will bring about an equalization of the rate of exploitation. So that the ratios between what's in the profit column and what's in the wage cost column are going to be the same in all the industries, if we make that assumption. Once again, I'll say it for the last time, in the real world it may not be like that. But that's not our issue right now. We can add that layer of abstraction as we build our theory up, layering of abstractions from the more abstract to the less abstract. We want to get the abstract layer in place first. So Marx is making a completely radical critique of capitalism. What he's saying is, give it all its best assumptions. Give it, if anyone studied neoclassical microeconomics, give it perfect competition. Let it have perfect competition. Now that's a very problematic concept, as you know if you've been reading Anu Sheikh. But don't worry about it for now. Give it that, and we'll still show you that there's exploitation imminently in that, right? In that system, exploitation is going on. Exploitation is the fact, let's just say that the profit is extracted at some equal rate. But the ratio between material cost and wage cost is a technological matter. some industries inherently have very large machine fixed capital costs relative to labor, and others have smaller ones, just because of the nature of the use values of the products that are being produced, right? And therefore, the material input costs ratio to the wage costs, and implicitly then material input costs to the entire value added, wages plus profit, are going to differ among the industries. And that's something you can't abstract from. That's not a matter of finding, a pure underlying exploitation case. That's an inherent feature of production. That's what differentiates the different use values from one another. It follows inevitably that the ratio of profits to the total costs is going to be different in all the industries. And Marx's example shows that. Now that means an incomplete transformation of capital into a commodity. If the law of value is to apply to capital, then the profit rate also must equalize among the sectors, you see? And the transformation which Marx spoke of, he spoke more of a transformation of surplus value into profit than of a transformation of values into prices of production, to use the old terminology, is going to result in the table on the right. Now they look exactly the same, right? Because we're not doing the quantitative numbers. We're not putting numbers in, okay? In the table on the right, and in the interpretation which I'm going to support, an interpretation which emerged throughout the course of the 20th century, because Marx never really resolved this problem. He left it in a certain state. He got very close, as I'll argue, but he didn't actually resolve it. So on the right-hand side of this top diagram, the ratio of profit to material costs and wages, the values have changed into transformed values. Marx calls them prices of production, in such a way that the rate of profit is equal in all the sectors. All right? Now, what then is the transformation problem? Well, one problem is that you have to come to the conclusion, inescapably, that the system as it appears in actual capitalist production with transformed values is transformed. It doesn't reflect the underlying social relations that are revealed so clearly by the embodied labor, by the embodied and direct labor calculations of the left-hand side. Okay? If you have equal profit rates, then the prices, meaning the absolute quantities of value in each of those boxes, that's what I mean by prices in this context, are different from the ones which are the total direct plus indirect labor time embodied. Marx originally started out by saying the price of a commodity would be total labor time in it. And now he's saying it's something else. So what in effect he's saying is that there is a pooling and redistribution process. Okay? Competition acts like a kind of a central fund. All of the capitalists have to line up and deposit their surplus value into this fund, right? And then go away. And then we're going to calculate the total amount of surplus value or profit, right, in relation to the total amount of capital, right? And we're going to get a rate of profit. And on the basis of that rate of profit, we're going to transfer some surplus value from one capitalist to another, so that the guy who came in with a higher rate of profit is going to have that reduced, and the person who came in with a lower rate of profit is going to have that increase, right? And there's going to be a redistribution of surplus value among all the sectors of the economy until the profit rate is equal. Now, what I'm going to assume in my tables, Fred is going to tell us a different story, but we'll get to that, and we'll talk about the differences when we come there, is that when that happens, since the material inputs and the wage goods are commodities that are produced within this system, and that's what we must assume, that therefore the values of the material inputs and wages are going to be transformed also. But that seems to go against the pooling and redistribution story that we just told. In other words, I just told a story which says, on the basis of the existing total capital, constant plus variable capital that went in, the profits are now going to be redistributed, but that means that the constant and variable capital sums are the same. But now we're telling ourselves that as a result of this transformation, those values are going to change, right? So there's going to be a transformation of the denominator as well as the numerator, you see, and that's going to complicate everything, right? That's going to make everything much trickier. Many people at the beginning thought, well, first of all, the Italian economist Loria, this is from Engels' prefaces to Volume 2, and, to Volume 3 of Capital, simply wrote, this is a theoretical suicide. You know, Marx has destroyed his system totally. A theoretical suicide. Marx has destroyed his system totally. And Bombawerk, you know, the famous Austrian critic of Marx, in his book called Karl Marx and the Close of His System. Close in that context meant completion of his system, not destruction of his system. But his position was clear. What Bombawerk said is, I cannot help myself, I see here a bare contradiction, you know, between these two tables. Either value is determined by labor time and you have a whole theory of exploitation, or you don't, you know, you have equal profit rates. But most Marxists didn't take that point of view at all, and in the 20th century the question became very different. They said, well, look, what Marx is saying is that capitalist competition obscures and mystifies the source of surplus value in exploitation of labor time. And sure, what would you expect it to do? That's one of its functions. In fact, a point that I make is that the mystification, the non-equivalence of certain ratios, and all of these things that result from this transformation is not only a byproduct of capitalist competition, it's actually an important component of the system of exploitation, because the mystification of the social relations, so that you can no longer see profit coming from labor time, you see it coming from capital, and therefore capital is productive of profit. This is the vulgar view, or the commonplace view that you'd expect to see. You know, that mystification is itself part of what enables capitalist exploitation to take place. That mystification confuses workers, disorganizes workers, makes possible all the contrary ideologies which affect workers. You know, all the people who are saying, I'm going to run my own business someday, you know, people, and get their life savings taken away as a result. It's kind of a very familiar story. Okay. So now, the question from the standpoint of serious Marxist theory is going to be, is this transformation from the left side to the right side tables consistent? Does it work? And the answer is going to amaze you if you're not familiar with it already. It's really one of the great triumphs of Marxist political economy, to my way of thinking, in the 20th century. We make use of some famous theorems, actually called Peron-Rubinius theorems in matrix algebra, to prove that not only is there a way, always, under reasonable assumptions, to make this transformation of prices to produce an equal rate of profit, going from the left side to the right in the table, right? Not only is there a way to do that, guaranteed, but there's only one way to do it. It's a unique solution. And never mind now about how we get that, but it's another subject, okay? And it works out. As a result of it, certain aggregates are going to turn out to be different between the two tables. So that, for example, Marx insisted, now look at the capital letters, okay? You see the two A's? Those two A's are the sum of the values of output in the untransformed system, and then go over to the right, it's the sum of the transformed values, or the sum of the prices of production. Marx insisted that those two A's would be the same, right? And in the way he does the transformation, they work out to be the same, almost by definition. I did not produce enough of these. I'm amazed at how many people are here for a session like this. I'm delighted. But anyone who, you notice one of the things that is here is my email address. I can easily send more copies of this out, okay, and answer any questions you have by email. Glad to do that, okay? The second thing that Marx talked about was the sum of the surplus value, which would be B, the capital letter B on the left, and the sum of profit, capital letter B on the right, those two also would be the same. All of this stands to reason. That is, if we're taking a given sum of surplus value, just handing it out differently to equalize the rate of profit, the two sums are going to come out the same. And if those two equal sums are going to be added to a constant sum, namely the sum of the material input costs and the wage costs on both sides, then clearly D plus C plus B, which is A, are going to also be the same, right? And so the sum of the profits is going to be equal to the sum of the surplus values, and the sum of the prices of production is going to be equal to the sum of the values. But all of this ignores what I take to be the inescapable property, as you study this, you know, that if there is a pooling and redistribution of surplus value, since that is going to mean a change in the prices of some of the goods, and if some of those goods enter into the production, are elements of the material input costs and the wage costs, then maybe in the next period, those differences are going to show up. And that capitalists are going to have to buy inputs, elements of constant and variable capital, at the new prices. Well, that means that arbitrarily the column sums are going to be different, and there's going to have to be another round of pooling and redistribution. And in that second round of pooling and redistribution, the profit rate will be really equalized, but that again will transform the inputs. And so you have an iterative process, a repeated process of adjustment. Now that process of adjustment by stages, that iterative process, leads to exactly the same result. It leads to this table, the one on the right. Okay? I know you can't really see anything here. This is just a very abstract representation of it. It leads to that table on the right. It's another one of the mathematical properties that we can prove. It's another way of solving the equations simultaneously. Now, how am I doing on time? Is anyone watching? When did I? Oh, it's getting late. I better start. I'm not going to be able to go through all of this. Let me go directly to the end, okay? Because there'll be more time. I may be able to cover some other aspects of it later. These are the questions, and I've actually got my answers written out. So this is a very easy presentation to make, okay? Why? What are the answers to the question? What do we need to do this for? Why does this matter? The first point is, if we don't get this right, then we're conceding it to bourgeois economics. Do we want to say that socialist economic theory is about good values, working class partisanship only, but that the economics, get it from any microeconomics textbook? Is that what we want to say? I don't think so, you see? And we do need to do what I call Marxist normal science. The term normal science comes from Thomas Kuhn in Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You know, there is paradigm shift, but in the periods between paradigm shifts, there's the gradual systematic accumulation of knowledge and of anomalies within the existing paradigm, which lays the foundation for the paradigm shift, which could not take place otherwise. Okay? So we need to not just attack orthodoxy from the outside, as I say here, but we need to actually be the scientific economics that we do. This, I emphasize, and we'll talk about this more later, is not just a matter of interpretations. It's not a matter of, well, my interpretation versus your interpretation, and the orthodox interpretation, or the standard interpretation versus the temporal single system interpretation versus the new view versus this, or the macro-monetary view of Fred, or any of them, and there are others. And Fred, in his book, Money in Totality, goes through these in great detail and shows you where they come from, including some that you might not have heard of. Okay. But it's not about that. It's about pursuing normal science and addressing the results that occur, addressing what we see, and incorporating that into our theory, regardless of what we think Marx would have said if he were alive. And he isn't. So he can't be in these sessions and help us. We have to do it for ourselves. Second point is, I made this in the morning session too. I just call your attention to the last sentence. There's no path from the 19th century to the 21st that does not pass through the 20th. You know, there's this idea that we have to get 21st century socialism right. which means everything they did in the 20th century was wrong. I don't believe so. I believe the 20th century made great strides, and that if Marx had lived into the 20th century, which would have been amazing, he would have been quite old, he would have been right there with that. And he would have been in with Sraffa and Meek and Morris Dobb and Morishima and Seaton and Leontiev, you know, and all of these people who worked out the analysis of the economy on which this is based, which is very different from the neoclassical analysis. Most important reason, and I'll stop at this point, we're not finished with the work of grasping capitalism at its core. Value theory is about the specificity of capitalism in general. You see, when you go to the specific, you don't talk about capitalism in Venezuela, or capitalism in Germany, or capitalism in anywhere else in the world. And as some people in this class would, this forum, you know, left forums would say, capitalism in China, or Russia, or any place, right? It's about capitalism as specific within the framework of exploitative modes of production. And that means capitalism in general. But we want to really understand how it works. And I submit that there are things about that that we don't yet grasp fully. And I'll stop with that rather intriguing idea. Okay.
I have, fortunately, 30 copies, so maybe that'll be enough.
Optimism.
I mean, there have to be some sharing, so please do, and pass it around. Thanks.
Probably not. Okay. That's all right.
That's mine, but we can share. So thanks to David for organizing the session. Thanks to all of you for being interested in coming. I appreciate that. And my talk today is an introduction to my book, Money and Totality, a macro-monetary interpretation of Marx's logic in Capital, and the end of the transformation problem, I contend. I argue there's the table of contents on the front page of the handout. And here come a few more copies, good. I noticed that there are paperback copies in the book fair, so you might want to take advantage. So as you can see, just a little overview of the book. Part 1 it consists of 2 parts. Part 1 presents my interpretation. Chapter 1 is a general introduction. Chapter 2 is an algebraic summary, which I hope clarifies some of the details of the logic. Chapters 3 and 4 present 180 pages together of textual evidence to support both macro and the monetary aspects of my interpretation, going through all the drafts of Capital and really paying very close attention to the development of Marxist thinking on these issues. So, and most of this textual evidence is, I think, to many people unfamiliar. Some of it just recently published for the first time. So I hope you'll be willing to take a look and reconsider perhaps this important issue. Then you can see Part 2 discusses a number of the other recent important reinterpretations of the transformation problem, Shake and Foley and TSSI and Ben Fine, etc. So I hope this comprehensive discussion will be helpful. It kind of sums up the work of a generation of Marxist scholars on this important topic. So you now you know what the transformation problem is all about, the apparent contradiction between the labor theory of value and the tendency of rates of profit to equalize across industries, right? The labor theory of value seems to imply that industries with unequal compositions of capital will have unequal rates of profit. Right? But that turns out not to be true in reality. And the critics argue that Marx, I would say, including David Laibman, argues that Marx tried to solve this problem in Part 2 of Volume 3, but that he failed. Right? And the failure was, as we heard, the failure to transform the inputs of constant capital and variable capital, and that is widely accepted as an important criticism of Marxist theory of prices of production. This was the crucial mistake, the failure to transform the inputs. This has been the main criticism over the last century, and the main reason given by economists and others for rejecting Marxist theory, because of this logical contradiction. But I argue, to the contrary, that Marx did not fail to transform the inputs of constant capital and variable capital, because they're not supposed to be transformed. Or to put it another way, as we will see, they are already transformed. And that the C and V are the same, both in the macro theory of Volume 1 and in the micro theory of Volume 3, and I'll say more about that. So my interpretation emphasizes the logical method, the logical structure, the overall logical structure of capital, and I reconsider the transformation problem from this perspective of the overall logical method, and I think the long debate over the transformation problem has not paid sufficient attention to this overall logical structure, and so that's what I try to emphasize. After all, this is a logical criticism, right? Marx failed to transform the inputs. There's a contradiction between values and prices of production. So in order to evaluate the validity of this logical criticism, we need to try as best we can to understand Marx's own logic and the logical structure of the overall argument. I think Marx's logical method is unique in the history of economics, and in particular is different from Sraffa's logical method, which I emphasize in my book and have one more to say about. So, I mean, this uniqueness makes it more difficult at times to understand Marx's logic, but it's not that difficult, and I think the extra effort is worth it. And there are two main aspects of Marx's logic that I emphasize, and as already indicated, I refer to these two aspects in modern economic terms as macro and monetary. And I think neither one of these aspects has been adequately discussed in the Marxian literature, in my view. Marx is often interpreted as essentially a micro-economic theory in all three volumes. The theory is about the determination of individual prices, as in mainstream microeconomics. But I argue Marxist theory is not primarily a micro theory. Marxist theory is primarily a macro theory of the total surplus value produced by all workers in the economy as a whole. Marxist theory is also often interpreted as only about labor time quantities, especially Volume 1. I think David is an example of this. But I argue that Marxist theory is about money from the very beginning, right? I mean, money is derived in Chapter 1, right? In the very important but often neglected Section 3. That tedious but very important, where money is derived as an essential feature of the labor theory of value, right? As the necessary form of appearance of abstract labor and socially necessary labor time. And then the rest of Volume 1, and then capital is defined as money, in terms of money, right? The title of Part 2 is The Transformation of Money into Capital, right? Capital is the title of the book, the central concept in the theory. Capital is defined as money that makes more money, right? And then the rest of Volume 1 is about how that happens, right? How it is that a given amount of money is transformed through the production and sale of commodities into more money, right? It's not just labor time. Money is the main empirical phenomenon that is being explained in Volume 1. Okay. So let me elaborate on those two aspects and first catch my breath. So first the macro. I argue there are two main levels of abstraction, or stages, in Marxist theory. First, the production of surplus value, and then the distribution of surplus value. By the way, page 2, by the way, there are a couple more copies here. Anybody not get a copy? Page 2, the back of the front page, is a kind of outline of what I'm going to be saying in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So two main levels of abstraction, the production and distribution of surplus value. The theory of the production of surplus value is at the macro level of the economy as a whole, and has to do with the determination of the total surplus value produced in the economy as a whole, presented in volumes 1 and 2. Then the second stage is the theory of the distribution of surplus value at the micro level, right, individual industries, and has to do with the division of the predetermined total surplus value into individual parts, presented in volume 3. First, the equalization of the profit rate across industries, the transformation problem, but then the rest of volume 3 is about the further aspects of the distribution of surplus value, the determination of the other individual parts of surplus value, commercial profit, interest, and rent. That's what volume 3 is about, the distribution of surplus value at the micro level of abstraction. And the key point about this macro aspect is that the production of surplus value is theorized prior to the distribution of surplus value. The total surplus value is determined logically prior to the distribution and the division into individual parts. Total surplus value is determined at the first level of abstraction, the production of surplus value, then the distribution and division at the second level of the distribution of surplus value. So there's a clear logical progression from the macro determination of the total to the micro division of the total. And this logical progression follows from Marx's basic labor theory of value and surplus value, right? Because according to this theory, all the different individual parts of surplus value come from the same source, right? Come from the surplus labor of production workers, right? And so the total surplus value has to be determined first because it's determined by this single factor, right? And then the subsequent analysis of the division takes into account other factors besides surplus labor that affect and determine these other individual parts, such as the competition among capitalists. The transformation problem is usually interpreted, and I think David again, as a transformation from one set of micro variables to another set of micro variables, from individual values to individual prices of production. But I argue that's not Marx's transformation. That's not Marxist theory of prices of production. Marxist theory of prices of production is about the distribution of surplus value across industries, and is a progression from not micro to micro, but macro total to micro individual parts. Right? So I mean, the transformation problem, I think, is really a disaggregation problem. It's not micro to micro. Volume 1 is about the total. Okay. There's so much to do here. One other aspect which I'll just mention and maybe come back to, a related aspect which follows from these two levels of abstraction is that Marxist theory in all 3 volumes is about a single economic system, the actual capitalist system, right? A common interpretation is a kind of two-system interpretation. Volume 1 is about a hypothetical value economy, and then volume 3 is about finally the actual capitalist economy. I argue that Marxist theory is about the actual capitalist economy from beginning to end, from the very first sentence, he tells us, right, to the end, first analyze at the macro level and then at the micro level. Okay, so I could say more about that, but I want to rush on to the second aspect, the monetary aspect, right? Because this, again, I think, is more controversial, and it's also the most directly relevant to the transformation problem. And I argue that the monetary aspect of Marx's logic has to do with what the general formula of capital, defined in chapter 4, and then the complete form of the circuit, as you see on the handout, the familiar MC dot dot dot, ending up with M plus delta M. Right? So this I argue, this circuit of money capital is Marx's logical framework. This is the way he analyzes capitalism. This captures the main feature of capitalism, right? Money, making more money, right? And focuses Marx's theory on an explanation of that most important phenomenon of the capitalist economies. And so this is very different from a Sraffian physical input-output framework, right? This is a monetary framework. It starts with money and it ends with more money. Okay, surplus value, right, is defined as delta N, right? As the increment of money that emerges at the end of the circuit of money capital. I think this is very important, and again, has not been, this circuit of money capital, it has not been given the attention that I think is required. Duncan Foley is a partial exception to this with his circuits of capital research, but unfortunately he doesn't follow through completely consistently in his new interpretation of the transformation problem. I also have on the handout a kind of symbolic, in order to contrast Marx's framework with the Sraffian framework, kind of symbolic representation of Sraffian theory in physical terms. And the most striking feature of this framework, in my view, is the complete absence of money. Right? And this is characteristic of Sraffian theory. And certainly no delta M, which for Marx is the most important phenomenon of capitalist economies. So we really have two fundamentally different logical methods that I argue they don't mix. Right? It's like oil and water in logical terms. And here is the crucial point of my monetary interpretation, that this logical structure, of the circuit of money capital suggests that the initial givens in Marx's theory of delta M is the M at the beginning of the circuit, is the initial M that capitalists advance in order to purchase means of production and labor power with the purpose, ultimately, of converting M into M plus delta M. The circuit of money capital begins with M, and Marx's theory of the circuit of money capital begins with N, begins with that initial money capital advance. It exists as a definite magnitude at the beginning of the circuit, which is taken as given, as Marx, but presupposed in the further theory of how that initial pre-existing quantity of money capital M becomes M plus delta M at the end of the circuit. Rushing on here. And the crucial point for the transformation problem is that the same quantities of constant capital and variable capital are presupposed, right, are taken as given, both in the macro theory of the total surplus value and in the micro theory of the distribution the division of surplus value. In both cases, the analysis begins with the money capital advanced, either first in the macro level and then disaggregated into the individual components of constant capital and variable capital in volume 3. The question that Marxist theory of prices of production is intended to answer is, how is the original money capital, the M sub I, we could say, how is the original money capital advanced in each industry recovered, right, plus the appropriation of an average profit based on the total money capital advanced in each industry. So this is a micro version of the circuit of money capital, which is the logical framework of Marxist theory of prices of production. And so I think it follows from this macro monetary interpretation of Marx's logic that Marx did not fail to transform the inputs. Right? The inputs are not supposed to be transformed. The inputs are the same. The actual quantities of money capital advanced, both at the macro level and at the individual industry micro level. So no transformation is necessary, and no, it's not appropriate. They are presupposed as the actual quantities of money capital advanced. That's why there's no transformation problem. They're not the inputs are not supposed to be transformed. Now let me say a little bit in the time I have left about give at least a kind of general summary or overview of some of the textual evidence to support this macro monetary, and a couple of examples are shown on the backside, page 4 of the handout, which I'll say a little bit about. Okay, first of all, I'd say the most important textual evidence to support, especially the monetary interpretation, is the circuit of money capital itself. Right? This is emphasized. This is the definition of capital. This is what Marx's book is about. And this is the framework within which he analyzes how capitalism works. Right? And so I think that the circuit of money capital itself suggests that the M at the beginning of the circuit is the beginning, the initial data in Marx's theory of M plus delta M at the end. In addition, there are many passages in all the drafts of Capital, and in chapter 4 of my book, I review them all, that money at the beginning of the circuit of money capital is taken as given, or what Marx often said, presupposed in logical terms. And one of the clearest such statements is the one on the top half of the back page of the handout from the so-called results manuscript, which was written as a kind of summary of Volume 1 and a transition from Volume 1 to Volume 2. And in this passage, Marx clearly states, right, repeatedly, that a definite quantity of money capital is what he calls the point of departure of his theory of the production of surplus value, and that the initial, he says, the initial quantity of money capital is given, right, presupposed. In the beginning of the process, he's analyzing capital as a process, with a beginning and an end, right? In the beginning of the process, Marx says, capital exists as a given quantity of money in which, please note clearly, all use values are extinguished. All use values, physical quantities, are extinguished. We're dealing with the pure monetary process here, right? Our task, Marx says, is to explain how the given initial money capital becomes more money at the end of the process. I think this is a very clear, succinct statement that the main goal of Marxist theory is to explain the delta M, and that the initial M is presupposed in order to, and combine with the labor theory of value and surplus value in order to explain the delta M. Another important set of textual evidence to support this monetary interpretation has to do with the concept of cost price, right? Introduced in chapter 1 of volume 3, cost price, C plus V, K is equal to C plus V, right? Which plays an important role in the transformation theory of prices of production in part 2 of volume 3, right? And in part 1 of volume 3, Marx derived an alternative formulation, algebraic formulation, for the value of commodities, right? And he expressed the value of commodities as K plus S, right? In terms of the cost price, right? Then when in part 2, when he gets to prices of production, he expresses the price of production in algebraic terms as the same K plus P, right? So the key point here is in his tables, in his examples, throughout, K is the same, right? So there's no transformation that needs to be made. K is the quantity of money capital advanced both in the macro theory of value and the micro theory of prices of production. One of the clearest statements on this important point is in the paragraph at the bottom of the last page of the handout, which unfortunately Engels left out of his edited version of volume 3. I discovered this, by the way, when I edited the English translation of Marx's original volume 3 manuscript, Marx's economic manuscript of 64-65, and this was one of the important discoveries of the differences between Marx's manuscript and Engels' edited version. And we can see from this passage that Marx states clearly and repeatedly the cost price is the same in the determination of both values and prices of production, including in unambiguous algebraic formulations, K plus S, K plus P, right? There's only one cost price here. It's not a cost price for values and a cost price for prices of production. Cost price is the same. And so no transformation is necessary. Again, I think this missing paragraph is clear and strong textual evidence to support the monetary interpretation of the initial givens in Marxist theory. The cost price is the same. There is no transformation problem. Too bad Engels left out this very clear paragraph. Let me say one more bit of textual evidence related to K is the same that I just discovered in recent months was Marx also wrote another manuscript which was published in German for the first time only in 2012. It was the last of the mega volumes in section 2, right? The manuscript is 67-68, right? So this is right after volume 1 was published, and Marx is still going pretty strong, right? And this is a very interesting, I mean, I don't read German, so I can only kind of read it superficially at this point. But it looks very interesting, has a lot to do with the turnover of capital. Both part 2 of volume 3, part 1 of volume 3, and also, this is the most relevant point here, there is a very, very interesting 30 pages in this manuscript that is about Marxist theory of prices of production, right, our subject here, right, in which he extends what he did in the manuscript 64-65 to take into account unequal turnover times across industries. Okay, remember, he mentioned that in the 64-65 and said, I'm not gonna deal with that. He comes back to that in these 30 pages a few years later, and you know, in 30 pages he doesn't get very far, but at least we get an idea about how he would address the problem, right? And one point that is very clear, including in the algebraic formulations, is that the cost price is the same, right? In the formulation of values of commodities and of prices of production, taking into account unequal turnover times across industries. Right? So again, I think the evidence is very strong, and I look forward to further discussion, and perhaps some discussion even of the algebra that's on one of the pages if there are questions. Thank you.
view of the fact that we each went over a bit, I'd suggest that we go directly to the audience. We were going to have a second round, but I think you heard from us enough. And we'll have a closing statement. But I'd just like to hear from everybody else. And I guess I'll be the one who, yes.
This is fascinating. I've just read again, I've been on the far left since the Vietnam era, 1970. I was in SDS, and I've just reread again under Michael Hudson's urging, volume 3 of Capital. And it's very complex for a person who mainly is a commentator on 19th century U.S. history and black history and so on. What I'm extremely curious about is, for both of you gentlemen, your sense of the psychology of Marx, of his development as not as a practical political person so much through the 1848 revolution, but through the writing of Capital. It seems like that his initial motivation was to destroy utopian socialism through explaining how capitalism really worked. And there have been some thinkers, Mr. Anderson, I think it's Kevin Anderson, who wrote a book, Marx at the Margin, about how Marx wrote a lot about Russia and China and other different forms of the evolution of capitalism. But in what way has this transformation question, has it intrigued Marxist economists? How much writing is on it? I just heard Michael Hudson, who talks a lot about debt, even ancient debt. To what extent would you two gentlemen say that this question has been an important question to academic Marxist economists? And how do you see the evolution of the thinking of Marx through the 1850s and 60s and what he was trying to accomplish? He obviously, as a brilliant thinker, just was simply curious. He really just wanted, as a thinker, to understand it. But I don't think that was his primary, original motivation. I think it was to go after the utopians. So I'm just curious as to how you see his evolution as an economic thinker in relation to this question.
I'm looking for, okay, yes, go ahead.
Well, my question is actually very different. It's much more focused directly on my bias is to agree with Fred's position. But I had, I guess, a question for David, which is, in the way the transformation problem has traditionally been constructed, like you described in the 20th century, the problem I always had with it intuitively, and then I eventually read some interpretations that supported my intuition, is that it removes time. There's no time.
No time.
And so not only does, I totally agree with Fred's point that Marx is a monetary theorist, but he's also a temporal theorist. I mean, it seems beyond dispute that everything Marx wrote is occurring in time. Now, I know you can get into here's where Marx says the labor time goes down by half, the value falls. I know that there are certain things like that, but to use your diagram here, that the inputs are taken as given at time 0, for instance. They're there, right? You have the fixed capital or what have you. The labor that adds the value occurs in time. There's a duration. It's labor time. But the problem that with the traditional transformation problem is that the outputs are treated as occurring at the same time as the inputs. So you kind of, on the one, it seems like you're sort of, it's always seemed like a contradiction to me, is that the inputs are there, labor occurs, and there's outputs that reflect the value from the inputs plus the new labor time added. So you can't treat the values of outputs as necessarily being the same logically as the value of inputs. And all of the transformation solutions do that. I mean, they, except for the temporal system, which, whether you agree with it or not, is the only system that basically says there's time now, there's labor time, and then there's the value produced after the labor time. And that seems to me fundamental, that distinction seems, and that's where I think that the 20th century interpretation, in addition to removing money, is inconsistent with both Marx and also with reality. If that's correct, that may be kind of a dense comment.
Let's go around a couple more, and should we do 3 and then sure, talk about them? Okay.
Yeah, my problem with, I've read volume 3 some time ago, some years ago, and my problem with the value theory and I think this is an aspect of the transformation problem, is not the way that it's usually posed. The way I understand volume 1 of Capital is that, and this often is not understood, and that is that the labor theory of a value is a theory of labor allocation in capitalist society. In other words, because there is no plan in the economy, if we have producers all producing independently, then the question poses itself as to how society reproduces itself. So if you just take simple reproduction, the reproduction of the state of affairs that was before, in this anarchy of production, the only way that this takes place is that, and this is what Marx says in volume 1, socially is when the socially necessary quantity of labor required for the production of any given commodity. The only way that reproduction can take place is when it is represented as a ratio of exchange between commodities. Now, and that is value. If when supply equals demand, then value will approximate price. Then society reproduces itself. It's in equilibrium, and simple reproduction will occur. But the problem that I always perceived going into volume 3 is that these equilibrium prices now that Marx has established in volume 1 no longer apply. Because now you have prices of production which give us an entirely new equilibrium point that is not the one that is established in volume 1. And I think this is the contradiction that von Bavarik comments on in Karl Marx at the close of his system. So I'd like to ask if you think that that's a real problem and if there is a solution to it.
Wow. Okay. How should we do one? Okay, let's take one more. Okay, we'll take 4. And then I'll try to keep our answers very brief so we can do another round.
Okay, my question is for both of you, no matter who answered, is that labor wages counted by price. Wage of labor force counted by price. But surplus value is counted by social equalized labor force, the value social value. My question is how Marx deals with the problem of price and the value. Price could be counted, but the value is abstract. The concrete and the abstract. How Marx deals this problem, relationship, to make his theory as a science and a philosophical concept, scientific concept, how they combine.
How should I? Yeah, okay. Let me try, and again, I promised before that I'd be telegraphic, and I wasn't. So I will try now. On the psychology of Marx, and I'm not quite sure everything that you're getting at, but what I get from this is, think of the manuscripts, 1862, 63, 1865, 1867, 68, after Capital, Volume 1, and there may be more to come. What amazes me, and what I love about Marx in this regard, is that amidst the storm of political struggle in which he's engaged, I could mention his personal financial problems and family, everything that was going on in his life, and he was deeply involved in the First International and the struggles of the German for forming the first Workers' Party in Germany, and everything that was, and his correspondence with everyone. He was so deeply involved, regardless of the details and the context, of the concept. He was deeply involved in the scientific study of capitalism. And I find that instructive, something that we ought to emulate. I was going to say that. There's a very deep commitment to the idea that we need to understand this thing at a highly abstract level if we're ever going to contribute to the formation of a working class movement that will overthrow and transform it. That to me is important. On the question of time, that you raised, I don't think the characterization of the simultaneous solution, if you want to call it that, from the as timeless or static, is correct. I don't think it's correct at all. I have put forward what I call, since people are used to acronyms, I would like other people to acknowledge that I use this to characterize my own view, but I don't think it's just my view. The theoretical time consistent structure view of value theory, TTCS. Now, what I mean by that is that unless you want to do temporalism in the sense of a complete abandonment of theory, everything is changing and technology is changing and social relations are changing, so things at one moment in time are not the same things at another moment in time, and it's all a jumble. And that's all we can say. If you want to apply theory to try to disentangle this reality, and I think that's prime Marx, I think that's what Marx was about. If he was about anything, then you have to approach time theoretically, so that what happens is you assume a certain set of conditions, in technology, let's say, and in social relations, the relations of production. Forces and relations of production are frozen at a moment so that you can study them, which is what value theory does. It studies underlying realities. And then you allow a process of transformation to take place. The simultaneous solution is exactly the same as a process in which you assume that inputs are different from outputs at each moment in time. Inputs, then there's an actual passage of time, production. You have outputs, the outputs are redistributed, prices are different. But now, and I think this is unavoidable, whatever you think Marx's intentions with regard to his methodology may have been, it's unavoidable that those prices, if they exist, are going to be paid by somebody. The ones which equalize the rate of profit in the transformation of outputs that Fred describes and that comes from Chapter 9 of Volume 3 of Capital, right? Those prices are going somewhere. So the price of this commodity goes down by 10%, let's say. Well, that means somebody is going to purchase that in a reproduction system, 10% cheaper. And that's going to affect whatever the rates, whatever the rate of profit was, whatever the equalized rate of profit was. It's going to have to be recalculated. You just cannot say, Marx's method says it won't, and therefore we won't. It's going to. And I completely accept Fred's textual work, which I don't do. And he's done this enormous, other people have done a lot too. But Fred's work is an important contribution to establishing. I completely accept that Marx was, that his, Marx didn't use these algebraic symbols, but that this is essentially what Marx was doing. This is the way he was thinking. It's clear throughout. You know, there are a few passages which suggest differences, but mostly this is what Marx was doing. We can put that part of it to one side. I think evolutionary biologists don't insist upon a certain formulation because Darwin said it. And mathematicians and physicists don't say, Newton said this, and therefore this is what we have to say. We have to call these quantities fluxions, and you can't call them differentials, because that's a bourgeois term. You know, that's not the way we should think as Marxist scientists. We stand on Marx's shoulders. I think it was Newton who says, if I have seen so far, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, I think that's the way we should think about Marx. And I think there's nothing static or anti-temporal about addressing the transformations that take place through time in systematic ways, in ways where you examine one problem at a time in order to get to the core, to the essence of a phenomenon. I think that's the philosophical way to approach that. On the labor theory of value as a theory of labor allocation, I don't think there's a problem. I think that when there's a system of prices of production, they function as centers of gravity around which there will be an allocation process, and that the allocative function of the system of markets is functioning yet around a different set of centers of gravity.
But that's the allocation.
I think all of the insights that Marx attached to that in his talk about the law of value in Volume 1 applies in that more elaborated context.
But that's the allocation of investment, isn't it?
But no. I have to go with what you said before and not engage. We'll get back. And finally, on Wei Xiaoping's question, I don't see that we should make a dichotomy between categories that are quantitative or countable on the one hand, like prices, and quantities that are abstract and therefore not quantitative. And I don't believe that. I think values and prices, first of all, they are in the same quantitative field. If there's going to be, for example, equality or non-equality as you choose between the sum of prices and the sum of values, you have to be talking about similar quantitative systems. And that these systems have these magnitudes have both quantitative and qualitative characteristics. And they are essentially the same characteristics in both cases. Just one quick side comment on money. I don't agree that what I am doing and what Sraffa was doing was non-monetary. I think you simply apply the MELT, the monetary equivalent of labor time, to Sraffa's calculations, and you can transform any one of Sraffa's tables into a quantity of money. Marx transformed back and forth between money and labor values. He's in Volume 1, and the examples he used in Volume 1. I think it's actually the second of my three figures that I really didn't get a chance to discuss, but I think there's an enormous confusion that arises. I just want to mention it, what I call the category error of saying that the transformation is between labor values and money prices, which many people do say. I've heard that, a lot of times. The transformation is from one quantity of labor value to another quantity of labor value, or from one quantity of money representing the original quantity of labor value to another quantity of money. Those are parallel transformations. And the issue of what determines the coefficient transforming a quantity of labor time into a quantity of money is a separate and important issue which can be taken up. But I don't think I don't think one can logically shift from one dimension to another dimension. Finally, since you're letting me complete this, You're very kind. Let me just say that I don't agree that I have a two-system view of the world. Here is the labor values and here are the prices. Yeah, I know, table 1 makes it look that way. But in table 2, I'm arguing, again, yes, there isn't a transformation. There's simply a value determination problem. It's a problem of the determination of the prices of production as quantities of labor time which yield an equal rate of profit. Now, your mind might stick on that a little bit. It's a tricky concept. But I think that's what the transformation issue is about. It's the unique determination of labor time, the solving of the problem of the actual scale of the labor values which equalize the rate of profit. They are not the same as the labor values which emerge directly as embodied direct plus indirect labor. There are different quantities of labor time. So in the upper right box of that second table is where you find that. Anyway, that was a little bit more there. Okay. Yes?
No, Fred's got a chance.
Yeah, let me.
Oh, sorry, yes, of course. I'm sorry. You got to
But you're next, right?
I worked that out.
the next speaker.
The first question about the evolution of Marxist thinking, I think this is a very interesting question. And as I suggested, chapters 3 and 4 of my book really go through, all 4 drafts, the Grundrisse, the manuscript 61, 63, 64, 65, and then the final versions of volume 1 with an emphasis on the development of Marxist thinking on both the macro and the monetary issues. And one thing that's very interesting is the manuscript of 61, 63, right, which was only published in recent decades. The full manuscript was published for the first time in German in the 80s and in English after that. The theories of surplus value is 2/3 of that manuscript, but the other third is a first draft of, a second draft of volume 1, right? Hitherto unknown, really interesting. Volume 30 of the Marx Engels collected works, the English translation, right? And then parts of volume 3 drafted for the first time as well. And what's really interesting about that is the Grundrisse of the first draft of Capital is all about the production of surplus value, right? All about capital in general, just that first macro level of abstraction. And he already has, I think, a clear idea of the logical structure, that capital in general and then competition, right? Production and then distribution, but he doesn't really get into the distribution part in the Grundrisse. And I don't think he really intended to in the manuscript of 61, 63, at least in the way he did, but he is kind of almost accidentally moved into a development of the theory of prices of production in his chapter on Rodbergus. There is an interesting story behind that, and he goes from there to rent, and then to interest, and then finally mercantile profit in a section just recently published for the first time. So you see before your very eyes the development of Marxist theory of the distribution of surplus value. And when you see this whole, the full manuscript. There are also important indications. I don't think he was really that clear that, to begin with, that the constant capital and variable capital in volume 1 has to be equal to the actual quantities of money capital. But I think he begins to get an idea about that in this manuscript 61, 63. I discussed that particularly in the chapter on Bailey, where he kind of builds on what Bailey's done and says, yes, I mean, the value transferred to the value of output is the actual constant capital, money capital advanced. Your question about time. I mean, I think my emphasis on the circuit of money capital suggests that time is important, right? That the initial money capital M exists at the beginning of the circuit, and then there's production, and then there's sale and recovery at the end. I have some disagreements with the TSSI, but I think I also emphasize the importance of time in the circuit of money capital, and that time must take place in order to produce that delta M at the end. Yeah, I would just repeat, in response to your question, you were kind of accepting, I think, the usual interpretation that volume 1 determines individual prices, right? And then you get to volume 3 and you get a different determination of individual prices, right? And I argue that the individual prices in volume 1, rigorously speaking, are representatives of the total economy. That this is a determination of the total price and the total surplus value, and the individual commodities as examples are intended as kind of typical representatives of the total social capital. And so then it's not a new, when he gets to volume 3, it's not a new determination of individual prices. It is the first determination of individual prices from the macro to the micro. I didn't quite understand your question, and we can discuss later. It seemed like you said, how can abstract labor be scientific? And it seemed like you were suggesting that in order to be scientific, it has to be observable. And I don't think that's true, right? I mean, I think abstract labor, because of the complications of unequal skills and different intensities, is not directly observable as such. But, so therefore you cannot empirically test the labor theory of value by comparing unobservable abstract labor with prices. I mean, individual prices are not supposed to be proportional anyway, right? But the way I think the appropriate way to empirically test Marxist theory is by not the direct comparison of values, labor, and prices, but rather the conclusions that are derived from the basic labor theory of value assumption. Profit, the conflicts over the length of the working day and over the intensity of labor, inherent technological change, right? Trend in the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. All of these important conclusions that are derived from the basic labor theory of value, I think, is the appropriate scientific way to empirically test this kind of theory.
All right, and now,
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you.
let's keep going.
Trying to be really fast if I can, but, yeah, and I like the way the talks complement each other in interesting ways. But first point, what may be a comment possibly, and I have a question, and the question is very fast, but the comment is about, I mean, maybe the compliment is on the whole notion of the circulation, right? Because a good example, students sometimes ask me, like, well, why isn't there surplus value on lumber, for example, or something like that, right? You know, in a sense, right? And the distinction between profit and surplus value, right? I think what's key, and I think clearly with David, really comes out from the notion of, laborers moving from one place to another as an equalization, that sort of human equalization, right? That laborers are at the center of a very complex, at the time understood that way, across the 3 volumes, a system that is moving across from, even into the consumption realm, and for reasons into the financial realm. So that as a result, the money is part of it, right? And is in a sense, if you follow what I'm saying, the idea is that basically the reason why laborers, we're going to say humans, and the abstract matter, right, is exactly because of that position, okay, in producing that, okay, in all the things that they do to contribute, and unwittingly sometimes, to capitalism, and the key 2 central elements, and I would add a third, but I won't go into it, commodification and wageification, in a sense, right? So that's why you could never say the lumber, right? Profit is quite distinct. Now, but that then leads to the second point, right? This is the second part of the question I would raise, which is on the your third point. You have your actual points, David, at the end, which is what happens when there's a quantity equality. If
What
it's
happens
still,
when?
No, your point about number 3 in answer to number 4, right? That at some point, even though we can still talk about a sort of essence of capitalism, which would say in a scientific way, you would have to agree that there is something. However, it can still transform even in its nature across that, right? And when you see what I'm saying? I'm not saying necessarily saying that, but I wanted to clarify that the nature of capitalism changes even though it remains capitalism. That capitalism that was still be recognized by anybody in 1840, in the way you must say, talking about Marx, would recognize it today without any question. But it was, there are the quantificated difference we can't go into, and I'll stop there. That raises a question, right? And so that the quantity of these specificities, do they change of quality? What I'm saying? Do they lead to a new quality? Play off angles a bit here, right?
I'll try to
Okay.
address that.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned that you, in order to solve the problems that you're working through, you came to Peron's theorems in matrix algebra. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to these mathematics, if you think that they are necessary for solving the problems, or if Marx could have worked through these things without, with the mathematics that were available to him in his time. And maybe also, David, if you would want to talk about if you think new forms of logic, such as like the revolution and sheaves and Grothendieck topology, has presented in logic, if any of this stuff you think is applicable in contemporary Marxist theory, just because it does generally seem like, I think, Laibman, a philosopher of mathematics, says that whenever mathematics is applied to something in the real world, it's always kind of an event. It's always kind of a small miracle, if you will. So I'm just wondering if you could just say a few words about how you got there. Like, were you just reading textbooks? I don't know. It would be interesting to hear about, I think, though.
Got it.
Could you just, in a nutshell, say what your disagreements with TSSI are?
Could you speak up?
Could you, in a nutshell, kind of encapsulate your differences with TSSI?
I have two questions
Yes.
for Laibman. The first one is that I think your iteration method is similar to your iteration method to solve the transformation problem is similar to Professor Sheikh and Professor Laibman. I think, but
Sheikh and who?
Laibman.
Laibman.
I think these two scholars they define different invariable conditions at each round of transformation. So I want to ask, what's your invariable condition at each round of transformation? Because we have to experience so many rounds to get rounds.
Realms.
Yeah, to get the input, the price of input equal to the price of output.
Oh, rounds. Rounds of.
Yeah. So, and the second question is, I think this the different rounds is just theoretically. It's not practical. But I think TSI rarely sees these rounds as practical. So I want to know your opinion. Is it theoretical or is it practical? Is it reality? And I also have one question for Professor Moseley about the presupposed constant capital and variable capital. If this input equal to the actual one, so I want to know are they reflecting the general rate of profit I mean, I think there may be one problem. If it is really equal, no. I mean, if the constant capital and the variable capital reflects the general rate of profit equals the average rate of profit, then the given K must be predict the determination of general rate of profit. But if it's not, then I think after the determination of general rate of profit, then the K will change. It will not be given anymore. So.
Okay. Shall we do those? Yeah. Okay. The question about evolution of capitalism and what is its essence, I'm not sure. Again, we'd have to talk more. I got everything that you're after here, but the idea that I'm putting forward is that contrary to the interpretation of Sraffa, which says everything is, it relates to actually my third diagram, the top of the second page, that everything is above the curtain. You know, it's only what we can see. Technology, money prices, the rate of profit, and so forth. There is a deep structure involving the social relations of labor, and that the Marxian aspect of this investigation is to go below the curtain and to find that deep structure. And what I think, and I know I'm on thin ice here because I wish I could nail this down and in a presentation give you, you know, my lifetime contribution to this, is that the problem with analytical Marxism and with above the curtain Sraffianism, if you like, is that they deny this deep structure level at which systematization takes place outside of the framework of individual optimization. Individual optimization is part of the story. If I'm offered 2 levels of wages at 2 different enterprises, I'll go where the wage is higher. If I'm a businessman and I see 2 rates of profit, I'll invest where the rate of profit is higher. Those are law of value types of phenomena, and they do occur. But that isn't the only way systematization takes place in a capitalist economy. For example, the balance of forces between a worker and an employer is affected by perceptions, whether valid or not valid, of the overall balance of forces in the economy as a whole. People say, well, that's just the way things are. This is what you can get for such and such, you know. And that those kinds of considerations lead to the deep structure level where the absolute values of labor quantities emerge and are a way of perceiving them. Now, I'm not going to go further than that because I don't have it further than that. I really think that in other words, I think value theory is a valid active pursuit as opposed to the above the curtain kind of stuff. By the way, I think it's an open question whether Sraffa would have agreed with me. And there's an anecdote, Fred knows it, I told it at the other session, but I'll skip it now because there's no time. Sraffa might have been perfectly on board with what I'm saying, but I don't know that he was. Secondly, on Peron, Rubinius, and new forms of logic, I can answer this very quickly. I don't know what you're talking about. It's not my area. I'm ignorant. I'd be glad to be educated. In general, you know Farhun Malkover. You know, it was a famous book from the 1980s which said value theory has to be interpreted in terms of very abstract algebra, which most of us have no grasp of. At least I don't. I don't know whether anyone else in this room does. Maybe, maybe not. You know, but I think that there's a kind of I called it in one article on the transformation problem, mathematicism. You know, a use of mathematics to impress. And sometimes I think it goes beyond, you know, where it really should be taken. But I really don't know this literature.
But didn't you mention that you used Peron's theorems?
Oh, I personally, I haven't contributed at that level.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I misunderstood that. I'm sorry.
My
apologies.
I did teach mathematical economics to doctoral students for many years. And I taught the Peron Rubinius theorem. I managed to teach us a very watered down version of it. But I'm not a first order researcher
Okay.
in that area.
Yeah, I'm
I'd
sorry.
love to be, but I'm
I
not.
confused what you said there.
Mathematics is an unrequited love. On the temporal single system interpretation, Fred said something about that. Let's not go into it now, but I just, my view is, I wrote a lot on this, and anyone who wants, use the email address, and I'll send you references and copies of things, if you like. It's
I don't think you have to worry about it. I think the question was to me, right?
I mean, it's either one of these right
Was it?
Either one,
But-
it's fine.
All right, well,
Trying to get you off the hook.
yeah, that's fine, but all I'll say, I mean, all I'll say is that it's a complete abandonment of theory. You know, it's, anyway, never mind this, I'll let, now on, and that covers Kleiman in the last question that I have written down. Sheikh, yes, his work on value is very similar to mine. Although, and he was one of the people who has written on the iterative, you know, the fact that you can approach the solution to the problem of value determination in an iterative form through a series of rounds or stages. And somebody mentioned the question of how many rounds of iteration. I don't know, as many as necessary in order to get to within a threshold, some threshold of difference below some epsilon, you know, so that you have practically achieved equalization of the rate of profit. But one thing in Sheikh's articles, I think there are 2 articles, is that he simply assumes total price equals total value and carries out the iteration on that basis. Fine, but you could equally have assumed total surplus value equals total profit. That's a different assumption, and iterate. And you'll get the same proportions, but a different magnitude, a different scale of values. Or you could assume total surplus, total net income is equal to total value added transforming into net income, which is a third invariance condition, and you get still a different set. In a general case where, well, never mind, the theorem that I proved in 1973, and no one has ever referred to it in print, but it clarifies all of these relationships. There are 7, and that's what those capital letters in the first diagram refer to. There are 7 invariance conditions, not 2. Equality, you know. And the literature refers to the twin equalities. Those are the ones that Marx mentioned, you know. But there are a variety of things which could be equal to one another, you know, various aggregates. And the truth of the matter is that, in general, only one of them can hold. And the others cannot hold simultaneously with that one, except in special cases where commodity composition proportions are the same. That's my theory. Anyway. Oh, there was the point about to what extent is any of this practical. If that refers to the empirical calculation of labor values, I'm rather skeptical. I haven't participated in that debate. It's a huge debate about whether you can invert technology matrix and actually compute and then compare prices of production with labor values and see what the percentage of deviation is. Sheikh was involved in that a little bit. Numerous other people have tried to do it and tried to do it for different countries. Basically the method that they use for getting their matrix of flow input coefficients, it seems to me, works for the elements on the principal diagonal, but not for the off-diagonal elements. For those of you who know what I'm referring to there, I think there's an element of indeterminacy in it. And in any case, the idea of getting empirical estimates of capital stocks at that level of disaggregation is entirely fanciful. I mean, the data just don't exist to do that. So I'm not convinced that that is an entirely useful exercise, except for what it might teach us about theory.
Yeah, I didn't think your question was about empirical estimates, but about whether the iterations, you used the word practical, but I think a better word is historical, right? Were actual historical periods, which is the way they interpret it, as opposed to Sheikh, where it's purely logical, right? The TSSI.
Oh, TSSI, yeah, yeah.
Right, right. So,
Okay. Sure.
that, I think, is what the question was about. Linear algebra, I'm going to be very contrary here. You know, I don't think linear algebra applies to Marxist theory in a rigorous, appropriate way, right? You can't use linear algebra, you know, an input-output matrix to study the circuit of money capital, right? That starts with an advance of money capital and not with given physical inputs, right? And you also have to assume that all industries have the same turnover period, right, in order to determine simultaneously, right? And for Marxist theory, as he sketched out in this last manuscript of 67, 68, you know, he can take into account the actual real-world circumstance of unequal turnover time. So, you know, I think that is, you know, useful for mathematicians, but not very useful for capturing Marxist theory. The TSSI. Let me say, first of all, I learned a lot from the TSSI. I mean, I think they made some important contributions, primarily the critique of simultaneous determination, right, which is incompatible with the circuit of money capital. So I think that, you know, certainly got me thinking along those lines, and I think a lot of other people too. My main disagreements is one that, particularly with respect to the transformation problem, is that their interpretation of the transformation problem, prices of production are not long-run equilibrium prices, right? They are short-run equilibrium prices that change every period in this actual historical iteration process, right? And I think, you know, this is a long discussion, which I discuss in my book, that there's a lot of textual evidence that Marx considered his prices of production as long-run equilibrium, similar to Smith and Ricardo's natural prices. Marx's critique of Smith and Ricardo was not that long-run equilibrium prices is not the appropriate prices, but rather that they were unable to explain long-run equilibrium prices with equal rates of profit in a way consistent with labor theory of value. And the other, I think, disagreement, just to mention, which really is outside the transformation per se, is they emphasize that constant capital should be valued at the original historical cost, right? And I argue that constant capital should be revalued at the current cost, right? That difference has to do with the effects of technological change, right? And technological change is really outside the transformation problem per se, but I would mention that as another important difference in a broader, with respect more to the falling rate of profit theory than the transformation problem. So your question about, well, if the K is eventually explained is equal to prices of production, which depend on the general rate of profit, then the K is no longer given, right? I would say, no, there's a logical sequence here, right? That in the volume 1 theory of the production of surplus value, K is given, right? Because K depends on prices of production, but prices of production cannot yet be explained, right? So it's just a given, right? And it's a given in the volume 3 theory of prices of production as well. But then, once prices of production have been explained, then Marx can say, oh, so now we see, right, we originally presumed as a kind of abstract partial explanation that C and D are equal to the values. But now we can understand more completely a more concrete explanation that they are equal to prices of production. That doesn't mean C and D are not taken as given in the theory of the total surplus value in volume 1. It means that there is a subsequent explanation of the initially given. See.
It's past time for this session to end. May I just mention one more thing before we go? I have written an article-length discussion of Fred's book.
Yes.
And Fred may write a response.
Fred has written a reply.
And I don't know about the reply, but my article will appear, it's in the World Review of Political Economy, which is put out by the World Association of Political Economy in China. It may not be an easy journal for you to get a hold of, but if anyone would like that article, and as soon as I have Fred's reply, I'll include that. So you can have everything.
It's in the current issue,
email
I
it.
think. It's
Oh,
your
is it? I haven't
article's
seen it
in the, I haven't seen it, but I'm told, and my paper will be in the next issue.
It's okay. So we would be glad to send you those. You
Yeah.
have our emails. His email is in the second page up here, and mine is on the top.
Thank you
Okay?
very much.
And if you haven't, if you